Welcome to the Global Ecological Cinema podcast from the Portland Eco Film Festival, where we share in-depth conversations about fascinating intersections of ecology, cinema, and filmmaking. Embracing the root definition of ecology, we explore what it means for humanity to have, hold, and transmit knowledge of planet Earth as our shared home through the power of cinema from around the living world. Kōbō Abe wrote Woman in the Dunes beginning in about 1960. It was published as a novel in 1962 to international acclaim. Kōbō Abe's primary cinematic collaborator, Hiroshi Teshigahara, brought Abe's own adaptation of the novel to cinemas 2 years later. Woman in the Dunes tells the tale of a self-absorbed entomologist named Niki Jumpei, who travels from Tokyo to a remote oceanside desert. He's there to search for rare tiger beetles in the hopes that he can gain acclaim by pinning his own name to an undiscovered version of them. After missing his bus back to the city, he's tricked by villagers who imprison Nikki in a deep sand pit with a mysterious woman who has been living in an expectedly rustic house down there for quite some time.
ご研究ですか?
そうそう。こういう虫をこの辺で見かけないかな。半妙っていう虫なんだけどね。あ、これ。
Beyond winning major awards, including several Oscar nominations upon its release, the film version of Woman in the Dunes is renowned as an art house masterpiece of the Japanese New Wave. Kōbō Abe's literary qualities are often associated with existentialism, surrealism, alienation, and absurdity. While all of these are appropriate to some extent, his expansive ecological imagination is present throughout his work. And while it hasn't gone completely ignored, like many things ecological in the fractured world that Abe critiqued, it has been underexplored, despite its singular mystique. This is why we selected Woman in the Dunes for inclusion in our Expansive Ecological Imagination series, which frames an ongoing exploration and motivation to do what the title of the series suggests: expand our individual and collective imagination about ecological possibilities, questions, solutions, and beyond. To help us delve into the ecology of Woman in the Dunes and Kōbō Abe beyond that novel and film, we turn to one of the foremost experts and scholars on Kōbō Abe.
Timothy Iles. I'm an associate professor of Japanese studies at the University of Victoria. I work primarily these days in the area of Japanese film, but also Asian film, Japanese literature, modern and pre-modern Japanese history, Japanese theater.
Like I said, foremost expert and scholar.
My PhD is from the University of Toronto, where I wrote on Abe Kōbō, looking primarily at his literature, but also his work as a playwright, a theater director, and his collaboration with the filmmaker Teshigahara. So that's basically me.
Dr. Iles, you've been learning, writing, and teaching about Kōbō Abe for decades. I'd love to hear about your early encounters with his work. How did that fascination and kinship first take root?
I used to be involved with a group of surrealist writers and painters. Through that connection, I sort of flirted with writing. And then I became interested in Japanese literature and avant-garde literature. And Abe had himself flirtations with surrealism and the avant-garde. And somehow it just became a natural attraction to his work. And the key themes that run through his work of a really independent individualism and so on really resonated with me, and some of the other things I'd been reading too, and the other values that I have. So it basically just developed from that.
Do you remember the first book you read by Kōbō Abe?
Probably The Boxman, which is a really interesting novel about a fellow who becomes obsessed with homeless people living inside, various cardboard boxes. If you go to Japan, you can see like the blue tent cities and the people living in literally cardboard boxes. And it can be really heartbreaking. But when you think, like as Abe did, what could lead an otherwise, quote unquote, integrated, individual into that kind of transgressive and then isolated existence. Well, that was the theme that ran through that novel. And it was a really interesting just exploration of the psychology behind isolation.
So how might we describe Kōbō Abe's ecological imagination, and what might it offer humanity's collective ecological imagination today?
Really good question. And there are a bunch of components to that. So if the idea of home for Abe is something that's alienating and vaguely isolating and so on, there's a related relationship there, and that's the one to nature. Right? Because after all, the human community is not in isolation. It is surrounded and integrated into nature. Traditionally speaking, and I'm really wanting to preface this really carefully, I'm not trying to speak on behalf of the entirety of Japanese culture here. I'm really not. For convenience's sake, I'm going to say things like, well, traditional Japanese literature does this. And, in broad strokes, it does. Traditionally speaking, in Japanese literature, nature operates as a vehicle by which human beings can express their emotions and can express their relationship to themselves, to each other, and to a greater universe. This is informed by the Shinto belief system. Shinto is the animistic indigenous religion of Japan that sees everything having a spirit dwelling within it. The fundamental and foundational idea of Shinto is really to value and contribute to community in the broadest sense. Now, that being said, Abe has inherited that literary tradition and that Shinto tradition. He is part of it. It's part of his, upbringing and so on. But in many ways, he really consciously writes against that tradition. So if we consider some of his early writings, like The Crime of S. Karma or The Badger in the Tower of Babel and so on, nature is a really powerful presence, but it's something that in many ways is mocking of the human experience, mocking of the human community, something that's exclusionary of human beings. So this is really the antithetical sort of position of a traditional, and in big quotation marks, traditional Japanese belief system. And you understand why the big quotation marks. I'm not speaking on behalf of the entirety of Japan. So for Abe, if we think of the novel Inter Ice Age 4, this is a really interesting science fiction detective story, but it's got an underlying theme of the necessity of human beings adapting the natural world to the needs of the human community. This is really not and in big quotation marks, not a Japanese idea. So what does Abe do with this idea? On the one hand, it's a cautionary tale. On the other hand, it really is a celebration of like science fiction and the potential of science fiction. And on the other hand, it's in some ways a backhanded compliment to the power of like human ingenuity to transform the world around us into something that we can use and exploit. And again, that's not a traditional Japanese idea. That's very much a Western Christian, theological perspective that the world is created by God for human use and exploitation.
奥さん、ちょっと起きてくれませんか。悪いけど、はしごを出してもらえないかな。はしごがなくなってるんだよ。
I'm really excited to hear some of your thoughts on the ecological aspects of Woman in the Dunes in particular.
Looking really broadly at the word ecology, coming from the Greek, right, the study or the understanding, the knowledge of home. That film in particular, Woman in the Dunes, and Abe's play Friends, Tomodachi. These are really concentrated explorations of the power and the danger of the community to impose an identity and a necessity of belonging on the individual. I mentioned earlier that for Abe, the idea of home is something vaguely alienating, vaguely hostile, and so on. We really see that in Woman in the Dunes. And also in Woman in the Dunes, there is the related idea of nature too, because we've got a community that's existing within a natural environment that itself is doing its best to extinguish that community. The community knows that it's in crisis. It knows that its environmental situation has changed such that it can no longer sustain itself through its traditional ways of being. And what those traditional ways of being are, neither the novel nor the film really makes explicit. So we can imagine for ourselves, well, okay, rural community, farming community, agricultural community, fisher community, what have you. The environment has changed, and that community is not able to adapt to this present environment. In the novel and in the film, we get some really, really gorgeous metaphors to describe that inability to adapt. In the novel, we have our protagonist dreaming about making houses in the shape of barrels that are able to float across whatever environment they encounter. In the film, we get a really wonderful visual metaphor of a boat buried in sand right up to its gunnels, and a boat in that situation is completely useless. Take the material of the boat and rebuild something that might be meaningful at that point. So I think in both of these situations, we get a pretty interesting comment coming from both Abe on the one hand and Teshigahara on the other, and working in conjunction to say, well, as the environment changes, human beings must adapt. And they must adapt not in a way that clings to an outmoded imagination of life or a way of life that is no longer viable. They have to adapt to the contemporary reality. And human beings, when they go out of their way to fight against that contemporary reality, are probably going to fail. And at the end of the film, even though our protagonist, in a bunch of ways, really becomes broken and integrated into the community, I can't see that ending as optimistic in any way. So I have to see the end of that film. But I'm sorry, spoiler alert, I have to see the end of that film as truly pessimistic, because it is a celebration from the community point of view of a failure to adapt to contemporary conditions and a breaking of the one individual who might be able to give a spark to this community to say, look, let's move on. Let's take what we can of ourselves that matter, our human relationships, and let's move them to another place that's viable. So let's, again, focus on trying to take something meaningful in our homes, which has to be the people who live here, and let's try to move these people and the homes that we collectively can build, and let's do this cooperatively in a place where everyone can actually contribute willingly, instead of trying to force people into a model that absolutely cannot work.
In both the novel and perhaps even more so in the film, despite his scientific background, I came to view the man in Woman in the Dunes, Niki Jumpei, as a largely anti-ecological and even anti-natural man.
That is an interesting way of looking at things. An anti-natural man is a really interesting way of describing this particular character. Niki Jumpei, his name, interestingly enough, translates into Niki plain and average. So he really is kind of an everyman. But at the beginning of the narrative, this way we can, describe both the novel and the film. At the beginning of the narrative, we have a high school teacher who is on summer vacation, and his great burning ambition is to discover a new variety of beetle so he can get his name immortalized in, the entomological study of, creatures around him. So this really is a person who doesn't want to study nature for the sake of nature. He wants to study nature for the opportunity to exploit nature for his own fame and his own benefit. That really is anti-nature, right? I'm looking at nature in a purely utilitarian, objectifying way. This is not something with which I can form an integrative community. This is not something from which I can benefit spiritually or, emotionally. This isn't something that I'm looking at even as with gratitude for the benefit it gives me in terms of like nutrition at the very, basic level. This is nature that I want to exploit for my own use. That really is anti-nature. So that's an idea that Abe develops in many of his works. In fact, I can't think of a single example where we have a character who looks out on a landscape and says, I see myself in the sunset, and I feel a sense of connection with the bees and the flowers. Absolutely not. And really interestingly, the film makes a greater acknowledgement of this throughout the course of the narrative. You're quite right. Niki's perspective on the village around him does change. He sees himself at the beginning as a prisoner because that's exactly what he is. But by the end of the narrative, he is trying to discover a way that by which he can contribute. But again, it's not a way that, really, I think, comes spontaneously to him. And I read somewhere, that if you chain an elephant, for a year with a solid chain, at the end of that year, you can replace that chain with a thread and the elephant won't run away because it's learned that it can't break that chain. I think in many ways, this is how Niki has now adapted to that rural community. He can't run away, and he's internalized that impossibility of running away. This is the domination of the individual by the community. So does he become now at the end of that narrative someone who celebrates community and its place within nature? Absolutely not. He really doesn't. That aspect of him, I think, stays pretty constant. He doesn't celebrate his place within the community. He's now just given up on everything else. He is a broken individual. And he's still, together with the community, sees his role within that community as fighting against the environmental situation, which is clearly untenable. He and the community know they cannot live in that environment, but he's adopted for himself, he's internalized that community's unwillingness to give up on their traditions and move on.
What いや、別に。あ、写真撮ってあげよう。そこへ立って。いやだ、そんな。いいじゃないか。笑って、ほら。
The complexity of Niki Jumpei and the woman in Woman in the Dunes is kind of astounding for me, especially in the novel. I think there's something about that novel that really demands that we be able to see the complexity of characters changing from one second to the next. This brought to mind the shifting, granular nature of being, which is a theme of the narrative vis-a-vis the sand. For me, one of the most anti-ecological things about Niki is the way that he treats the woman. But I'm curious, for you, who is the woman? To what extent does she represent something besides herself? And how is that part of the ecology of this narrative?
A really interesting question. Female characters appear pretty consistently in Abe's work, but very, very often as a force of mystery, a vaguely antagonistic, sometimes explicitly antagonistic force, some creatures, beings whom the protagonist often objectifies, occasionally has, as you say, very complex and fundamentally suspicious relationships with. The woman in the Dunes comes to represent many things beyond, simply herself as a character, and a member of that community. She says very often that, she's a part of the community because the community is the only thing that will take care of her. In some ways, she represents, and again, great big quotation marks, traditional view of individual contribution within a collectivist hierarchy, a feudal hierarchy. Traditionally speaking, Japanese society is built along collectivist, hierarchically feudal lines. The individual receives meaning and identity and merit from the ability to contribute, to that clan and that feudal hierarchical social structure. The woman in the Dunes does that, but she also represents a voice of tradition too. She herself is terrified of leaving where she is because the bones of her husband and her child are there. The bones of her past are there. So we can look at her as, big quotation marks, the voice of common sense within a collectivist imagination, a traditionalist imagination. Well, we've always done things this way, therefore we always have to do things this way. We've always done things this way because the bones of our ancestors are here, and we're honoring them by carrying on the means of life that they've created for us. And she's also quite willing to exploit others and participate in the exploitation of others to protect her own community. So in many ways, there's a xenophobic relationship between the village, represented in the woman, and outsiders. We don't have to care about outsiders. We've got our own community and we're going to carry on with that. All that being said, there is kindness in her and there is great compassion in her. And there is a tremendous desire on her part for the man to, finally to integrate into the community and have that warm life that she sees him as lacking. No one has come to look for you. You've been missing now for how long, and no one has come to look for you. No one cares about you. We care about you. You should join us and integrate with us. On the one hand, that's a really positive and very compassionate, view of relationships between individuals. This is another theme that runs through Abe's work. Women in general for Abe, they're very complex characters, and it's remarkable how well Abe is able to create complex characters in a situation that's fundamentally very simple. We've got a man and a woman. The man doesn't want to be there. The woman wants him to be. That's it. That's the plot. But out of that and the interactions that they have, tremendous complexity evolves. A lot of this comes from, the woman's side. I feel my identity from this community of which I'm a part. I live because the community helps me survive. This is something that the man himself simply cannot understand. There is that remarkable tension between the two of them. In many ways, we do have to, divide this along gender lines. That's quite true because, Abe has done that. But it's more of I think, a transcendent. It transcends gender. It's the idea of belonging or individualism. Where do we place ourselves on that spectrum?
Could you please talk about metamorphosis in Abe's work and how it might relate to his ecological imagination?
Metamorphosis, the transformation of the living, individual body, you can look at it as, evolution on steroids, really accelerated evolution, which is an attempt to adapt to shifting environmental conditions. To go back to the short story I mentioned earlier on, Red Cocoon, where our protagonist is searching for a home, the story ends with the protagonist literally wrapping himself somehow into a silk cocoon. That's an early and, really clear examination of, the possibility of transforming the individual physical body to adapt to, both a physical and an emotional need. Metamorphosis in Woman in the Dunes occurs, it certainly does, but it's much more metaphoric in that the protagonist doesn't change physically, but his clothing does. At the beginning of the film, he's wearing Western clothing. He's got, a great pair of hiking shoes and a shirt and cargo pants and the whole bit. And at the end of the film, he's wearing traditional Japanese kimono-styled garment and, large, traditional crest and the whole bit. That is a, metamorphosis of fashion that's, really metaphoric for the transformation, within the character's psyche and sense of belonging. Other stories, Inter Ice Age 4 is literally about, the accelerated adaptation of all range of species, aquatic mice, aquatic dogs, aquatic human beings, and so on. This is, part of that sort of urge towards like surrealism on the one hand and science fiction on the other. The theme seems to be, if only we could change ourselves, we wouldn't have to worry about anything. But that sense of transformation, to me, doesn't strike me as trying to acquire a true integration or respect for the environment around us. It's almost, arming yourself for battle with better weaponry. To go back to the red cocoon, why is he making this silk cocoon spinning for himself? Well, it's a protection, from the outside environment. It's a place where this protagonist can be purely, safely, comfortably isolated from everything around him, right? And ultimately, that's the home. That story ends very ironically with a stranger picking up the red cocoon and giving it, as a toy for his child to play with. So that's a bit of a failure. But nonetheless, it's an attempt to create a protection or a sense of some sort of security from a hostile environment. And that's literally what we find in Woman in the Dunes, too. Instead of adapting the human community, right, there is literally a fight against the changing environment to which human beings cannot adapt effectively.
That reminds me of something you said earlier that made me rethink Woman in the Dunes as a sort of allegory for what happens when a community that for whatever reason has been led astray is suddenly dictating for an individual what home is. And that's something very relevant to contemporary ecology, especially when I think about the future. I often feel, and when I talk with young people, I get this feeling a lot, that there's a sense that the future has been canceled, that the future has been decided by someone who's completely inaccessible to us, that the fate of humanity's home is in who knows whose, but somebody else's hands. This brings to mind global warming or climate change. And you've mentioned this book a few times, Inter Ice Age 4. I unfortunately haven't been able to get my hands on it. I think it's out of print. My understanding is that it was written in 1958, 1959, right before Woman in the Dunes, and that it's widely regarded as a precursor to what we now call climate fiction. Can you talk a little bit about this book? Was it Abe's most explicitly ecological book? And why does Inter Ice Age 4 matter?
I think it matters quite a lot because I think you're quite right. It really does presage a world of dramatic change. The causes of that change, that's something, that the book doesn't really make explicit. Sea level is rising dramatically. And at the very end of the book, the last sort of island of, Japan, the last couple of meters of the island, the sea, swallows them whole. I mean, climate change is real. The idea that the future has been canceled, this is a really resonant idea with not only the environmental situation, the economic situation, the contemporary political situation in, both the United States and other parts of the world. The suggestion that dictatorship is becoming remarkably popular in really disturbing ways, and the face that dictatorship is wearing of, we're doing this because you've asked us to. Coming back to Inter Ice Age 4, it is in many ways really representative of many of the themes that run through Abe's work: the attraction to science, the interest in solving a mystery. It's a detective story. It's a great work of science fiction. We open with a group of scientists who are telling us about a predicting computer, basically a form of AI that the Soviets have developed. And so therefore Japan is developing its own, counter AI that's able to predict the future. And there's really an AI arms race. And the AI arms race is suggesting that by a certain date, which is only a few years away from us, the world's first true communist society will be born. And by 20 years after that, the final capitalistic society will disappear. And along the way, the environment's going to change and sea level is going to rise, and so you better get ready for it. And so in order to get ready for it, a group of Japanese scientists start developing mammals that can live and breathe underwater. So dogs with gills, human beings with gills, and so on. This really is ecology, sure, absolutely. But it comes back to that idea of, are we adapting to a change in our environment? Are we adapting in a way that's going to be maximally flexible, maximally integrative into that shifting environment? Or are we going to do something that will allow us further to exploit and dominate the environment around us? And you can make an argument kind of for both ways, right? In this particular novel, the environment is changing, therefore we're going to have to change. So we become, aquatic human beings and so on. But at the same time, the entirety of the economic system that evolves out of this, shift, in the environmental situation is still capitalistically exploitative of natural resources. And it's not, a quote unquote traditional integration into an environment, with which we can interact subjectivity to subjectivity. That is a really pessimistic view of ecology because it's one that says human beings are still at the top of the food chain. And is this Abe's most explicitly ecological work? In some ways it is. But then there are other works, again, that deal with issues of nature and so on. His very last completed novel, Kangaroo Notebook, has a protagonist who discovers plants sprouting out of himself and so on, and goes through that process of transformation. And in many ways, that carries on with that theme, of an individual unable to adapt to a shifting environmental situation. And we can call that, an exploration of a very pessimistic view of ecology in its broadest sense. We are forever outside of the possibility of a warm and compassionate and inclusive home in which we are a collectivity of subjectivities, who are able to respect each other.
どうしようか。
バカバカしい。
しかし、一応チャンスだからな。
ってきゃいいんだよ。
そうか。しかし、そう大げさに考えなくても。
何、色気違いじゃないし。
If people who just watched Woman in the Dunes, and who hopefully will read some of Abe's work, were inspired by the film and inspired by Abe and Teshigahara's collaboration, what else might they appreciate?
Abe and Teshigahara collaborated on 4 films. They're all really, really worth watching. They really are. Tanin no Kao, The Face of Another, a really chilling exploration of, again, individualism. There is a great film called Ikiru, To Live, by the director Kurosawa Akira. It's really superb too, in terms of, again, the power of the individual to contribute willingly and in a meaningful way to a community around the individual. I'm overwhelmed with choice. There are so many things that people should look at. There's an absolutely superb Japanese film that's really crazy and a lot of fun. It's called Yaji and Kita. It's a contemporary film, color, wonderful works of fantasy, and so on. Yaji and Kita, The Midnight Pilgrims. If you want to have just a great fun time exploring, relationships, the nature of relationships, an absolute absurdist deconstruction of Japanese history. It's a wonderful, wonderful, great postmodernist, absolutely fun film to enjoy. Oh boy, animated films to enjoy. Ghost in the Shell is really superb for an exploration of the nature of identity. Also Spirited Away, which is everyone's favorite movie, of course. There's a great film called Metropolis, an animated film. We just don't have enough time to talk about all the things people should be. You quit your jobs, people. Just, start watching movies and do nothing else, right? How's that?
Dr. Timothy Iles, thank you for joining us, for sharing your perspective on Kōbō Abe's expansive ecological imagination, and for all the good you do in the world. If you haven't explored the work of Kōbō Abe, including his cinematic collaborations with Hiroshi Teshigahara, I hope you'll find the opportunity. If you have, I hope you'll talk about it with your friends, family, and strangers. Woman in the Dunes, The Face of Another, Ikiru, Yaji and Kita, Midnight Pilgrims, Ghost in the Shell, Spirited Away, and Metropolis are all available to rent at the world's best video store, Movie Madness, in Portland, Oregon. The Portland Eco Film Festival's special presentation of Woman in the Dunes, in beautiful 35mm, was featured in our 2026 Expansive Ecological Imagination series. You can find more about that, including a list of questions to consider in relation to this theme, at portlandecofilmfest.org/expansive. The 2026 Portland Eco Film Festival is sponsored by Cragg Law Center and Solve. We are a signature program of the Hollywood Theater, Portland, Oregon's premier modern historic movie palace. Learn more at portlandecofilmfest.org and hollywoodtheater.org. Our theme music is from the song Earth Worship by the amazing band Rubble Bucket. Our Global Ecological Cinema podcast is hosted, edited, and produced by me, Rosel Medina. Thanks for listening, and for all the good you do in the world.
I feel like I'm collapsing into myself, yourself, myself, yourself, myself. I would like us to break up.